Now, that's my brain there, just in case there were any problems, so sorry for the delay. Good evening, everyone. First off, I'd like to make a confession, which is that there's something of an element of a guilty pleasure about this for me this evening, because really, if you think about it, to be offered an occasion to talk about yourself and to be gifted a willing audience, it doesn't happen too often. So sincere thanks for that opportunity. And I certainly hope that there might be moments that resonate in a useful way with you in understanding dementia. And I hope too that my particular experience of living with dementia may offer some useful perspectives. So this isn't so much clinical or scientific, more up close and personal. I suppose the main feature of my particular experience with the disease is its two very distinct phases. Firstly, as a companion and carer of a very particular kind to my father, who suffered and died from Alzheimer's in the 1980s. And then secondly, my own diagnosis in 2014, 25 years later, as a patient living with the disease myself and how I'm adapting to live with that. So, the first phase first. Reel back the years. Can you remember much of the 1980s? The wedding of Prince Charles and Diana, the Rubik's Cube craze, the Pac-Man video game. Well, when all that important stuff was happening, unknown to my family, my father was developing Alzheimer's disease. The disease had a very limited profile at this time. Nothing like the awareness that exists now was present, and even the name itself seemed very strange and odd. My father was Ronan Smith, very busy in the world of Irish theatre in the 1980s, and his reaction to discovering his cognitive function declining: hide it. Tell no one. Not his wife, not his sons, not his colleagues, not his friends, and certainly not his GP. My father was a workaholic before the term was coined. Obsessive, stubborn, single-minded. And he had at this point a considerable set of achievements in the world of his work. He was founder of the Dublin Theatre Festival, chairman of the Olympia Theatre. Tours of his theatre productions went to the West End and Broadway. And he was founder and owner of the modestly entitled Ronan Smith Theatre Academy, which was probably the best-known acting school in Ireland for a number of decades, to be fair. He was emphatically not up for retiring, so he hid the symptoms. He ducked and dived, improvised and bluffed, desperately hanging on to the world that he had so painstakingly built up. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, I was living the life of Riley. I had just qualified as a solicitor, but immediately dropped anything to do with law and went gallivanting off on the merry life of an actor. I'd acted as a child occasionally in TV and film work and on stage as well, and had really enjoyed the excitement, so it wasn't all that surprising, I suppose. The genes won out, and it was great fun, certainly more so than conveyancing and drafting wills. But my mother was beginning to ring me regularly, very worried, very upset by my father's behavior and performance at work, because as well as her own career as an actress, she also worked with him in many of his activities, and she saw the decline functioning at very first hand. So I started, somewhat reluctantly, listening, and I decided to take a break from my carefree life as a strolling player and came to help in the office. Well, I was lit upon by his colleagues. They told me, in a way that they had been hesitant to use speaking to my mother, about how very seriously threatened all his affairs were. And so I started the painful process of dismantling, behind his back, his roles in the various businesses, while at the same time covertly making him feel I was helping him keep the roles. I felt like a thief. But it had to be done if his reputation and his achievements were to remain intact. All very furtive, hidden, and spoken of in whispers. At the same time, we had managed to persuade him to start seeing a doctor about his health. The doctor, luckily, quickly saw what was happening. It was actually quite advanced at this stage. He'd hidden it so remarkably well, so much so that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's was given to my mother and myself, not to my father. Having thought about it, my mother didn't want to have him informed. It was too late. There was no point in her view. Neither myself nor my brother Julian, who was living and working in New York with a young family at this time, we weren't sure we agreed. But we felt as she was his life partner, it was her choice. So that is what we did. And I still feel ambivalent and uncomfortable about that to this day. Events began to tumble on very quickly at this point. His functioning deteriorated ever more rapidly. His behavior quickly became more and more unreasonable, more unmanageable. He refused to stay at home, refused to be minded, became very angry, so much so that we very quickly had no option but to commit him into care, into St. John of God's Hospital in Blackrock for his own safety. He had to be certified by 2 doctors at the same time as being mentally unstable and requiring compulsory full-time care. He couldn't actually take in what was happening to him, and he never came home again. He spent his last declining years in Bloomfield Nursing Home in Donnybrook, progressively losing more and more of his functioning. Then he quite suddenly and very surprisingly became quiet, agreeable, placid, smiling, and he remained that way until he peacefully passed away. Now, at this time in the 1980s, there was a very small Alzheimer's Society with no paid staff, run entirely by a committee of volunteers, and it was in fact even hard to find useful information about the disease. Hard to believe given the great and thorough support that is available now, but that's how it was. We had reeled about pretty much alone, too traumatized by the immediate crisis to ferret out any help. But once we had stabilized things with my father in Bloomfield Nursing Home, I joined the committee, fueled by the emotional hurt I'd experienced, and on top of that, the anger at the truly appalling services available to assist us. So I helped on the committee for a couple of years, and also did some advocacy work even then, talking publicly about my father's illness. In fact, there's a second guilty admission for the evening. If I'm really honest, when recently I dug out an old videotape of an interview on the Late Late Show that I contributed to in early 1990 in order to help raise awareness shortly after my father's death, my strongest reaction to seeing it was actually embarrassment at the width of the lapels on my Saturday Night Fever jacket. More important to note, however, is that overall we have, as a society, come a very long way since then in dealing with dementia, and that is to be welcomed, although there is still much work to be done. I stepped down from the committee after 2 years, having stayed to see in the establishment of a small full-time staff, and Alzheimer's left my life, or so I thought. 24 years later, in 2014, phase 2 started when I received my own diagnosis of Alzheimer's. After a particularly pressurized and stressful work period in late 2013, I had, with my wife Miriam's encouragement, gone for cognitive tests in the memory clinic in St. James's Hospital. The result was a diagnosis of, quote, probable early stages of early onset Alzheimer's disease, unquote. Something of a mouthful, really. The probable bit was the best bit, of course. The early stages and the early onset had a nice sort of softening effect. But the word Alzheimer's was there at the end, too big, bad, and ugly. This time the beast had landed at my door. It took a while to absorb, yet in a strange, unfortunate, but very concrete way, it was probably easier to absorb than if I hadn't had phase 1. So I worked out a mantra for myself. Plan for the probable, work for the possible, and hope for the future. Plan for the probable, that's all the boring, practical stuff. Enduring power of attorney, organising finances and other affairs as best as can be done, redoing a will to reflect the likely circumstances, all that. It's important to attend to these issues. Don't run away from them. There's plenty of good advice available. And the more comfortable we can make people feel to talk about their condition, the more this really helpful response to it will be acted on. Work for the possible. Well, that's about altering your lifestyle to best combat the advance of the condition. Concrete activity is always good. It counters the debilitating effect of passivity. So first, ensure regular physical exercise. Take up meditation or mindfulness. Eat the right diet. The ketonic or Paleolithic diet is my choice. Hobby horse moment here. We eat far too much wheat and cereal in our diets, which does not suit our systems, and our bodies do in fact require protein more. In addition, a certain amount of things that are currently taboo, such as fats, and the organ that needs for the fat the most appears to be the brain. Diet is a big issue for me, and I do feel physically better, more energetic, and I'm sure I'm functioning better now as a result. Hope for the future? Well, this was probably the big one. I might have been a bit slow on the uptake on this one, but it took me a while to realize that hope is nothing other than a decision. You decide to hope. It doesn't alight on you from afar. It's not a gift. And then you have to decide to hope again. In fact, it's a decision that you have to make and remake again and again. So that's what I do. And there is reason to hope. It is rational hope, not certain hope, but it's rational. All those people in their white coats sweating away in laboratories, drafting through research data, they are making progress. Now, one can be hovering on the cusp for some time, I know, but it's good to be there, and I'm watching with great interest. But I don't feel at the same time the need to indulge in voodoo. My being hopeful and positive won't deliver a cure or help in any way to do so. But for me and my family, it's simply a better way to live with present realities. And I've been keeping up my professional work. I feel I'm lucky to work in the arts world where difference and eccentricity are tolerated, if not actually encouraged. And I know being an early stage dementia sufferer in other worlds of work could find it much harder to stay working longer. And that is something that needs to change. For myself, I think I need to make that bit more effort to achieve the same work output as I did, but I'm, of course, watching myself like a completely self-obsessed hawk, looking for the slightest sign of dysfunction, adding an additional layer of stress on top of the stress levels of the job itself. And I suspect stress probably doesn't help in slowing the beast's progress. However, whatever about my personal experience, what I do feel very strongly about is advocating for the larger profile of the illness to be known and understood. The typical cliched image of the elderly person languishing in the nursing home, sinking into decline, is very, very far from the whole picture. There are significant cohorts of people with early stage dementia who are dealing well with it. And for them, it's a very minimal and manageable manifestation that does not yet have to disrupt the substance of their lives. They can and should be supported through this period, allowed continue their lives, perhaps marginally compromised by early symptoms, but not excluded from society, nor ostracized or avoided out of ill-placed embarrassment. The disease is a moving target. Well, actually, it's worse than that. It's a moving target that changes as it moves, a challenging situation of real complexity. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but openness and alertness can certainly help live with the process. People don't have to be afraid of it and don't have to be awkward about it. How I make sense of it is by referring to it as an acquired progressive disability. It arrives and currently it tends to progress. In its early stages, it's very thin. It's like a wedge. It doesn't have much impact and it's not a reason to declare your life over. It's really important that the public in general get to feel more comfortable dealing with it, hear more about it, get less afraid of it, because there is a lot of fear, a lot of discomfort, which can so easily lead to a stigma attaching to it and the heaping of even more pain and suffering onto the burden of patients and carers. And would you believe a third confession for the evening? The advocacy work I do, in fact, makes me feel better. It's not all altruism. Given that I have the condition, it actually makes me feel better to wrench some good from a bad thing. So, returning to the purely first-person perspective, here for what it might contribute to the discussion is mine. It has, in fact, a kind of duality. Firstly, in the personal dimension, I accept my diagnosis and I work with it. I take recommended medication, but I also adopt what I regard to be effective and important lifestyle changes of diet, exercise, and meditation. I also hope a conscious, deliberate decision to remain optimistic of medical advances in the near future. And in the public dimension, in the social sphere, I unhesitatingly and freely ask for compassion and understanding. But at one and the same moment, and without shame, I don't hesitate to demand my basic human rights to respect and dignity, irrespective of the condition. I know all of you are here because you're interested in learning more about the condition and what it means to live with it. I hope you might then help to show others that stigma, fear, and avoidance have absolutely no useful role to play in helping people live well with the condition. Thank you.